The letter that arrived after the murder. A Hercule Poirot mystery. In certain houses, behind well-bred voices and carefully shaded lamps, truth waits with extraordinary patience. This evening, if you will come quietly and attend to what seems at first too small to matter, you may observe Monsieur Hercule Poirot place one neat hand upon disorder and oblige it, at last, to speak. The ring at the front door was so violent that it cut across Mrs. Agnes Harwood's sentence as though an impatient hand had drawn a knife through silk. Then Moxon appeared in the doorway with a silver tray, and even from across the room one saw at once that the letter upon it was not part of the household order. It had the rough urgency of express delivery. Rain shone upon the envelope. A blue seal, foreign and ecclesiastical, showed darkly against the cream paper. "For Mr. Harwood, madam," said Moxon. "A special messenger from the station." Mrs. Agnes Harwood did not start. She never started, yet her hand, which had been lifting her coffee, rested a fraction too firmly upon the saucer before she set it down. "My brother-in-law has gone to the library. He dislikes interruption when he is looking through his papers. Benedict asked for letters to be brought him at once, if marked urgent," said Clara Dean from the writing table near the window. Her voice was level. Only Poirot, who sat a little apart with his small tasse de café and his expression of courteous detachment, observed that Miss Dean had spoken before reflection, as a person repeats an instruction too carefully remembered. "Did he indeed?" said Agnes. "How singular! Moxon, you may leave it on the hall table." Richard Harwood, lounging by the mantel with an indolence that never wholly concealed a restlessness of nerve, flicked ash into the grate. "If it has come by express from the station, it is hardly a county circular. Better take it in, Moxon." "It bears a Belgian stamp," said Miss Bell suddenly. The old governess had poor sight and yet noticed the things one might have wished unnoticed. She leaned forward, her thin hands upon the head of her cane. "That blue seal, conventual, I think." Eleanor Vane rose. She had youth, and with youth that compassion which makes tension unbearable before it becomes intelligible. "I will take it to Uncle Benedict." "No." Agnes spoke too sharply. She amended the sound of it at once. "No, my dear, your uncle may be irritated. He said he required 10 minutes. "Then they are certainly up," said Charles Fenwick, glancing at the clock on the mantel. "He has been gone nearly 15. The remark fell. Nobody took it up. The silence which followed was trivial on the surface. Yet in that silence Poirot became aware of several distinct attitudes. Clara Dean had gone very still. Dr. Simon Vale looked with professional habit at the clock rather than at the people. Richard Harwood smiled faintly as a man smiles when he has been thinking of something not fit for company. Agnes Harwood reached to straighten by the smallest degree a framed photograph on the mantel. A photograph of a young officer in uniform, his expression candid and grave. The frame had stood a trifle awry. "I think," said Eleanor with gentle determination, "that irritation is less alarming than mystery." Before Agnes could object, she had crossed the room and gone into the hall. They heard the quick softness of her steps upon the carpet, then the opening of the library door. Everybody moved. Poirot was not among the fastest, but he was among the first to arrive because he lost no motion in confusion. Eleanor had retreated against the hall wall, one hand at her throat, white to the lips. Moxon, with the silver tray still in his hands, stood petrified near the stair. Agnes came forward erect, controlled and colourless. Richard brushed past Charles so violently that the younger man turned with an oath. The library door stood open. Beyond it the green-shaded lamp upon Benedict Harwood's desk cast a bright circular pool in which the room appeared at once intimate and indecently exposed. Benedict Harwood lay on his side beside the desk, one arm doubled under him, the other extended as though still in the act of reaching. A paper knife of carved ivory projected from below the breastbone. A chair had been thrust back. 2 drawers of the writing desk stood open, though not wide. On the hearthrug near the fender lay a key. "Don't touch him," said Dr. Vale. Nobody had touched him. The authority of death itself prevented it. Poirot went first, not to the corpse, but to the door. The key was not in the lock. The lock itself was ordinary, the kind a householder trusts because it looks more decided than it is. He touched neither lock nor handle. "When did anyone last see Mr. Harwood alive?" he asked. Richard answered too quickly. "We all saw him leave the drawing room." "At what hour?" "About 8:15, said Charles. 8:17, corrected Clara Dean quietly. The quarter struck as he was at the door, and he turned back to ask me whether I had put the Brussels correspondence in the red file. Again that word, Brussels. Again that faint, almost invisible stiffening in Agnes Harwood. Dr. Vale had knelt. "He is dead. The blow went straight in. There cannot have been more than a few minutes." "A few minutes before the cry?" said Poirot. "Yes." "A few minutes before the arrival of the letter, perhaps?" Dr. Vale looked up. "Possibly. Why?" Poirot inclined his head toward the tray which Moxon still held, as if attached to him by fate. "Because we have here an event which belongs to the same chain, and it is always better not to break the chain too early." Agnes Harwood entered the room at last. She had not rushed in with the others. The delay had been scarcely noticeable, but it existed. She stood looking down at Benedict. Her face did not collapse. Her grief, if it was grief, was of a disciplined and withholding kind. "This is dreadful," she said. "But I must ask everyone to keep calm." It was an astonishing sentence to utter over a murdered man, yet not one wholly unnatural to a woman who had directed the order of a household for 20 years, and perhaps supposed calamity itself could be made to wait upon propriety. Eleanor spoke from the hall. "Aunt Agnes, he was writing something." "Yes, my dear." Agnes did not look at her. "Simon, you will send for the police." "Certainly," said Dr. Vale, but Poirot lifted a hand. "With pleasure, doctor. Send for the police. But no one leaves this room or the hall until a few matters have been made precise." Richard turned sharply. "What the devil do you mean?" "I mean, monsieur, that your uncle has not died of the weather." Poirot's voice remained mild. "Someone in this house struck him down within the last quarter of an hour. If one allows at once for movement, exclamation, generosity, indignation, the little traces vanish. Order first." At the word order, his glance travelled again to the mantel. Agnes's eyes followed it, and in that second she did a strange thing. She crossed behind him, reached up, and corrected the photograph frame so that it stood exact. Poirot observed without seeming to observe. "You think," said Charles Fenwick, "that one of us killed him?" "My friend," said Poirot softly, "I think nothing yet. I arrange." Clara Dean still had not approached the body. She stood by the desk, looking not at Benedict, but at the uncapped pen and the empty sheet dated at the top. Her self-command was so absolute that it seemed almost a rebuke to the others. Only once did it fail, when her gaze moved to the express envelope on the tray, and for the space of a heartbeat some emotion, not fear, not grief, but recognition sharpened by dread passed over her face. Miss Bell saw it too. "You know that seal?" she said. Clara turned. "I have sorted Mr. Harwood's Continental papers for 2 years. It resembles others." "From a convent?" "I do not know." "But you said Brussels," Richard flung out. "She said the Brussels correspondence," said Poirot. That is not precisely the same thing. He moved then at last to Benedict Harwood's desk. Without touching the papers, he bent over them. There was a faint scent of lavender from the blotter, and beneath it, from somewhere in the room, the colder odor of extinguished fire. The open drawers contained neatly tied packets of letters, bank papers, and a red file which, curiously, seemed to have been taken out in haste and put back without its papers aligned. Benedict Harwood had been a man of arrangement. That small disarray had the violence of a shout. Moxon shifted under the burden of the tray. The envelope slid slightly, and Poirot held out his hand. "Permit me." The butler surrendered it. A breath seemed to pass through the room. Agnes Harwood did not move, yet her fingers, joined before her, tightened until the knuckles whitened. "Who is Sister Ursula?" Eleanor whispered. "Nobody, perhaps," said Agnes. "A charitable person. Benedict had many correspondents." Poirot looked at her. "And yet, madame, it is odd that a nobody should arrive by express precisely at the moment when Monsieur Harwood is murdered." Poirot turned the envelope in his hand, feeling through the paper the shape of more than one sheet enclosed within. "We shall open it," he said. He broke the seal neatly, preserving the fragments in the hollow of his hand, and drew out not one paper but three. A brief covering note in French, a folded legal extract on stamped paper, and inside that, an older letter so worn at the creases that it seemed to have lived a long while in darkness. Poirot glanced first at the covering note. His brows lifted, but he betrayed nothing. He passed it to Clara Dean. "You read French, mademoiselle?" "Yes." "Then oblige us." She took the sheet without visible tremor. Only when her fingers touched the old enclosed letter did their certainty falter. She read in English, translating as she went. "Monsieur Harwood, according to your request, I send by express the certified extract from the register concerning the child Claire Elise Vautrin, afterwards entered under the name Claire Dean. I also enclose the letter placed in our keeping by the late Madame Elise Vautrin, to be delivered if ever Monsieur Julian Harwood, or his family after him, should seek the truth. I regret my delay. My illness has been severe. I pray that this may yet serve justice. Sister Ursula." "Read the rest," said Poirot. Clara unfolded the legal paper. Her voice, though low, carried perfectly. "This is to certify that on the 17th day of October, 1901, there was entered in the register of births at Sainte-Cécile, Bruxelles, the child Claire Elise Vautrin, female, of Elise Vautrin, widow, and of Julian Harwood, father acknowledged by signed declaration deposited separately." The paper slipped slightly in her hand. Eleanor stared. "Julian Harwood? The Julian in the photographs?" No one answered her. Everyone was looking at Clara. She lifted her head slowly, and for the first time her perfect self-command deserted her. "I did not know," she said. Richard gave a short laugh that broke off at once. "My God!" "Be silent," said Agnes. Her authority struck across the room like a cane upon a table. Then, as though conscious that she had revealed too much force, she turned to Poirot. "This concerns ancient and painful matters. Surely it need not be read aloud over the body." Poirot held out his hand. "The old letter, if you please." Clara surrendered it. The paper was cheap and had browned at the folds. The hand upon it slanted with a youthful haste. Poirot read it silently first. Then, after a pause in which one became aware of the clock ticking and of rain beginning again against the window, he read aloud. "Julian, Madame Harwood has told me that you repent all and desire never to see me again. I do not believe it, and yet I am afraid. If I am wrong, burn this, and I shall trouble you no more. If I am right, come to the little gate of the convent garden in the Rue des Tilleuls on Thursday at 6. I must tell you that our child will be born in the autumn. Whatever you decide, I shall not use the child against you, but I cannot live under a lie. Elise. Madame Harwood, said Poirot gently. That is a curious phrase, is it not? Agnes met his eyes. Curious, yes. Relevant, no. There were misunderstandings in those days. My husband was alive. I had no knowledge of any child. Richard swung round. Mother, did you know this woman? I knew, said Agnes, that Julian had formed an absurd attachment to a foreign governess. Benedict encouraged him in frivolity as always. The affair ended, that is all. The affair ended, repeated Poirot softly, but not, perhaps, in the manner supposed. He laid the letter upon the desk beside the blank sheet dated that evening. The juxtaposition was unpleasantly eloquent. The voice of a dead young woman beside the unwritten intention of a murdered old man. Eleanor moved suddenly to Clara's side. Miss Dean, Clara, sit down. Clara did not sit. No, thank you. Her gaze was fixed on Benedict Harwood's body now, and in it there was neither calculation nor horror, but a grave bewilderment, as though the dead had at last spoken and left her the worse for hearing it. Dr. Vale rose. This can wait until the police arrive. On the contrary, said Poirot, the police will do very well with facts made clean in advance. He turned to Moxon. This messenger, he waits? Yes, sir, in the servants' hall. I thought it prudent. Excellent. No one has paid him and sent him away? No, sir. Poirot nodded. Then our time of arrival may be made exact. Richard struck the mantel with the back of his fingers in a gesture too violent to be accidental. The photograph frame of Julian tilted again. He stared at it, then swore under his breath and set it straight with abrupt tenderness. What does the time matter? He demanded. Benedict is dead. Either this damned letter caused it or it did not. The time matters because human beings like to place motives where they see envelopes, said Poirot. It flatters the intelligence. But if Monsieur Harwood was dead before the letter entered the house, then we must search deeper. The murderer may have feared what was coming, yes, but also he or she may have acted upon knowledge already possessed. Charles spoke at last. You think my uncle knew the contents before it arrived? Poirot turned. Did he confide in you? No. Charles flushed. He rarely confided in anyone, but he sent for me this afternoon and spoke of repairing an old injustice. Those were his words. I supposed he meant money. He often used money as if it were a moral instrument. A just description, said Agnes coldly. And what, said Poirot, did he say to you, madame? To me? Before dinner, during dinner, at any time today. Agnes considered. That was the remarkable thing. She appeared not to remember, but to select. Benedict informed me that he intended to make certain changes in the household arrangements. He was often changeable where dependents were concerned. Clara's head lifted at that. Do you mean me? I mean nothing personal, Miss Dean. Please do not invite scenes. The rebuke was controlled, almost courteous. Its cruelty lay in that very courtesy. Eleanor coloured angrily. Richard turned away. Charles half moved as though to intervene, but Poirot prevented him with a glance. One scene, madame, has already occurred, he said. The others are only explanations. Miss Bell, who had remained at the door as though schooling herself not to look again at the dead, now spoke in her dry old voice. Benedict was disturbed all day. He dropped his spectacles at luncheon. He never dropped things. At 4 o'clock I met him on the West Passage, and he asked whether Miss Dean had been in the schoolroom cupboard where the photograph albums are kept. It appeared a foolish question. She had no reason to go there. Clara frowned. I was never there. Yet he asked it. Poirot stored the fact away. Small, perhaps useless. Or not. Moxon returned from the servants' hall with the messenger, a boy of 19 in a wet cap and too large coat. He looked from the assembled faces to the body and nearly dropped the receipt book in his hand. Your name? Albert Finch, sir. You brought this express? Yes, sir, from the 6:50 train connection. I was delayed at Havisham village because the bridge lane's half flooded. What hour did you reach Foxley Court? The boy consulted his book desperately. 8:26, sir. Mr. Moxon signed at 27. Moxon bowed confirmation. Dr. Vale said quietly, Then Benedict was almost certainly dead before the letter arrived. And yet, said Poirot, someone in this house had reason to dread the truth inside it. Richard gave a sharp sound. Meaning Miss Dean? Clara looked at him, not wounded, not indignant, but with a calm that made the accusation seem vulgar. If I had known that letter proved I was Julian Harwood's daughter, Mr. Harwood, I should have had reason to wait, not to kill. Poirot's eyes warmed. An admirable observation. Agnes said, Or an admirable calculation. Poirot bent to the desk. Mademoiselle Dean, when Monsieur Harwood went out of the drawing-room, he asked for the red file. Was it here? Yes, I brought it in myself at 7:30. What did it contain? Continental correspondence, old inquiries, 2 letters from Brussels, draft instructions to his solicitor, and... She stopped. And? Clara looked not at Poirot, but at the open drawer. And a draft codicil to his will. Richard said in a hoarse voice. To whom? I did not read it fully. Did you not? Agnes's tone was almost lazy. You had singular opportunities. Clara's colour rose. I have never opened Mr. Harwood's private papers without instruction. No? Agnes's gaze flickered toward the drawer. Then perhaps someone else has. Poirot followed that glance. The papers in the red file were not quite square. One edge protruded by perhaps half an inch. He did not touch them. Instead, he said very softly, Until the police come, nobody will touch anything at all. Not the desk, not the body, not even, if you please, the photograph on the mantel. Agnes Harwood looked up so quickly that one might have thought he had uttered her name instead. She recovered herself instantly, but it was too late. The quickness had been real, and Poirot had received it. What can a photograph matter? Agnes asked. In a house where everything is arranged, said Poirot, the small displacements are often the most talkative. Richard made an impatient movement. Must we stand here discussing mantel ornaments? Surely the police will ask the obvious. Where were we? What did we hear? Who had reason to want money? Excellent, said Poirot. Let us begin with the obvious, and see how long it remains so. First, said Poirot, the cry was heard by all. Before the cry, what sounds? Moxon answered from the threshold. Only the front bell, sir, and Miss Vane's going down the hall. No voice raised in the library? No fall? No, sir. Dr. Vale said, These old carpets swallow noise. The blow need not have produced much disturbance. Just so. Now, each one of you, from the moment Monsieur Harwood left the drawing-room. Charles spoke first. I remained by the fire. I was talking to Richard. Richard said, Talking. We exchanged 2 sentences at most. I went to the window. Eleanor clasped her hands hard in her lap.
I sat by Miss Bell. Aunt Agnes asked whether the claret had been too warm. It seems grotesque to remember, but she did."
"It is not grotesque," said Poirot. "It is human. And Miss Dean?"
"I was at the writing table. Mr. Harwood had asked me after dinner to sort some receipts."
"When he rose, he asked about the red file, as I told you. Did you follow him?" "No." "Did anyone leave the drawing room before Mademoiselle Vine?" There was the briefest pause. Then Agnes said,
"I did, for a moment only. I went to the morning room for my smelling salts. The room was warm."
Richard turned. "You did not say that?"
"My dear Richard, no one has yet catalogued my movements for your approval."
Poirot's eyelids lowered. "How long were you absent, madame?"
"Perhaps a minute."
"And you encountered no one in the hall?"
"No one."
Clara looked at her, then away. Poirot caught the glance. It had in it not contradiction exactly, but resistance to something remembered. "You doubt?" he asked. Clara started.
"I beg your pardon?"
"Madame Harwood says she met no one in the hall. You looked as though the statement touched a memory." Clara hesitated. There it was again, the hesitation of a conscientious person unwilling to create ugliness, and yet unable to surrender fact.
"I cannot be certain of the time, but when I crossed to the escritoire for the receipt basket, I heard the library door close. A few seconds later I heard movement in the hall, very light. I supposed it was Mrs. Harwood."
Agnes said smoothly,
"Then you support me?" "Not entirely. The steps seem to go toward the library, not away from it."
Richard whistled under his breath.
"My dear Miss Dean," said Agnes, "one would think you had trained yourself to hear footsteps through upholstery." "No," said Clara, "I have trained myself to hear when Mr. Harwood rings."
Poirot inclined his head. "Useful. And you, doctor?" Vale replied, "I had gone to the bookcase near the piano to look at a medical monograph Fenwick had mentioned. I saw nothing except that Harwood appeared out of spirits all evening." "Because of this letter expected from Brussels?" "Perhaps. He did not confide in me." He let the remark settle, then turned abruptly to Charles. "Monsieur Fenwick, you said he summoned you this afternoon. At what hour?" 4:30. "In this room?" "No, in the study upstairs. He asked whether I intended to marry Eleanor despite his reservations. I said yes." Eleanor looked at him with sudden distress. "Charles?" "I see no reason to conceal it now. He said I had charm and insufficient income, a combination he disliked. Then he asked, quite coldly, how I should answer if the circumstances of the household altered unexpectedly." "In what sense altered?" asked Poirot. "He did not explain. I told him I should still marry Eleanor if she wished it." Poirot considered. "And was he satisfied?" "No. He seemed almost disappointed." "Curious?" Richard laughed shortly. "Not curious at all. My uncle liked to set tests. He had been a magistrate too long. He wished to hear people declare themselves from the witness box." "And you, monsieur? Did he summon you?" Richard's brows contracted. "He sent a note after tea." "What note?" "Come to the library at 9. We must speak plainly." That was all. "Do you have it?" Richard put a hand into his breast pocket, produced a folded slip and handed it across. Poirot read it. The handwriting was Benedict's, bold, regular, with a firmness not yet old. "Did you answer?" "No." "Did you know what he wished to discuss?" Richard shrugged, but the motion was too casual. "Money. He always wished to discuss money with me." "Debts?" Charles made a slight movement. Richard shot him a warning glance. "If you like. Cards, horses,
One thing and another. Ah, said Poirot, the infinite category. Agnes's mouth thinned. Richard has been foolish. Benedict enjoyed magnifying the foolishness. Magnifying or paying? She did not answer. There came then, from the side table near the window, a faint metallic sound. Everyone looked round. It was only Moxon setting down the tray at last because his hand had grown tired. Yet in that nervous assembly the smallest sound had force. Poirot crossed to the tray. Beneath the express envelope lay 2 visiting cards, one of them wet at the edge from contact with the letter. He lifted it. It belonged to Benedict Harwood himself. Upon the back, in pencil, stood 2 words. After dinner. To whom was this addressed? Poirot asked Moxon. The butler peered. It was on the salver in the hall, sir. I assumed the master had written it for one of the servants. Clara said, He asked me at dinner for a card. I gave him one from the tray by habit, but he said he no longer required it. I thought nothing of it. Poirot slipped the card into his pocketbook. We continue to think nothing until the right moment. Then it becomes a great convenience. Miss Bell stirred in her chair. If you are collecting small absurdities, Monsieur Poirot, here is another. At 7 o'clock, before we dressed, I crossed the West Passage and heard voices from the library. Benedict's and a woman's. I did not stop. The woman spoke very low, but I heard her say, You had no right to bring me here for this. Eleanor looked up sharply. A woman? Miss Bell nodded. It was not your aunt. At least I do not think so. Clara said at once, It was probably me. Mr. Harwood questioned me about the Brussels letters. I objected to his manner. Did you indeed? Poirot asked. Yes. Her chin lifted a little. He was kind in many ways, but he could be imperious. And what precisely did he ask? He asked whether, before coming to England, I had ever known the name Harwood. No one moved. Poirot said, And your reply? That I had not, which was true. Did he believe you? I think he wished me not to be telling the truth. The phrase had distinction. Poirot saw, as perhaps nobody else did, that Clara had suffered in Benedict's company, not crude oppression, but a more refined cruelty. The pressure exerted by a man who supposes that because he has discovered a truth about another person, he has acquired moral precedence over that person. Agnes looked toward the desk. This is endless. The police will soon be here. Can nothing useful be done? Much has been done, said Poirot. Already we know that several people had private reason to fear or expect a conversation with Monsieur Harwood this evening. We know that a draft codicil existed. We know that an old wrong from Brussels touched the present household. We know also that between 8:17 and 8:26 there was time enough for murder and for at least one movement in the hall not yet clearly accounted for. Richard's face hardened. And because my mother stepped out for her salts and Miss Dean heard a door, we are to suspect anyone. Poirot's answer was very soft. Not anyone. Everyone. At that moment the front bell rang again, this time with the sober authority of official arrival. A constable's tread sounded in the hall below, followed by another, heavier. The county police had come. Agnes straightened automatically, as if receiving late guests. Richard flung away his cigarette and crushed it with unnecessary force. Clara put one hand for an instant on the back of Benedict's chair, not for support, but as if anchoring herself to the fact that the dead man had been real, had spoken, had concealed, had meant something at 9 o'clock that would now never be said by him. Poirot turned once more toward the mantel. In the slight draught from the opening door, the photograph of Julian Harwood had shifted again, no more than the width of a fingernail, but enough to offend the eye. The room had acquired, in that recurring small crookedness, the expression of a face trying and failing to compose itself. "Before the inspectors ask their questions," said Poirot, "I should like one thing made clear. Who among you knew before this evening that Sister Ursula of Brussels still existed?" No one answered at once. Then Agnes Harwood said, "I did."
Inspector Mallory, who entered at that instant with a square, country face and a competent reluctance toward drama, looked from one expression to another and understood at once that he had arrived in the middle of something already dangerous before the murder began. "Monsieur Poirot," he said with respectful brevity, "I was informed you were in the house."
"Unfortunately, yes. Fortunately also, perhaps."
Mallory's glance took in the body, the papers on the desk, the people stationed in attitudes too deliberate to be natural.
"We'll proceed quietly. No one leaves." "That has been already suggested," said Poirot. "Good." The inspector turned to Agnes. "You said you knew this Sister Ursula." Agnes answered without hesitation. "I knew of her. Long ago my late brother-in-law's son Julian was entangled with a Belgian woman of poor circumstances. There was distress. My husband handled what needed to be handled. A convent became involved after the woman's illness. I believed the matter ended 25 years ago." "Did Benedict Harwood speak of it recently?" "He asked questions this week. I told him what I knew, which was little." Mallory took notes. "What exactly did he ask?" "Whether I recalled the name Elise Vautrin, whether I remembered a child, whether my husband had written to Brussels." "And your answer?" "That I recalled a distressing liaison, nothing more certain." Clara, standing rigid by the desk, said in a low voice, "That is not what he told me." All heads turned. "What did he tell you, Miss Dean?" asked Mallory. "That Mrs. Harwood had always opposed what she called sentimentality and believed Julian saved from disgrace." Agnes's eyes sharpened. "If Benedict repeated old family irritations to a secretary, he behaved disgracefully himself." "Perhaps," said Poirot, "but the dead often cease to care for propriety." Mallory went methodically on. The body was examined, the knife noted, the doctor's estimate taken down. It was agreed that death had occurred before the express letter arrived. A constable was posted in the hall. Another went to telephone the station and summon the police surgeon. Moxon and the servants were reserved for later questioning.
Then Mallory asked the practical question around which so many English murder inquiries have turned. "Who stood to gain by Mr. Harwood's death?" Richard laughed once, almost offensively. "There it is." Eleanor said with distress, "Please." The inspector looked at Clara. "You mentioned a codicil." "Yes." "Did you see the beneficiary named?" "No." "Not even by accident?" "No." Mallory opened the red file, more roughly than Poirot would have liked, and drew out the papers. Draft letters, continental inquiries, a memorandum to the family solicitor, an unsigned codicil, unfinished, with blank spaces for witnesses and date. He read. So did Poirot over his shoulder. By it, Benedict Harwood revoked earlier dispositions in part, and bequeathed a substantial portion of his personal estate and the income from a trust to Clara Dean. Being the natural daughter of my late son Julian Harwood, as will, I have reason to believe, shortly be proved to my complete satisfaction. A smaller legacy was made to Eleanor upon marriage. Certain existing provisions to Richard remained, but were notably reduced. Richard's face altered visibly as Mallory summarized the effect. Agnes did not move. Yet all the colour seemed to withdraw from her mouth, leaving it narrow and chalky. "So Miss Dean gains," said the inspector. "And loses," said Poirot. Mallory glanced at him. "She gains money, yes,
But if she is innocent, she loses at the same stroke the ordinary quiet of a life constructed without certainty. To learn one is the child of a dead man and the centre of a scandal, believe me, Inspector, not everyone calls that profit. Clara stood very straight. Thank you, Monsieur Poirot, though it makes no difference. No, said Agnes. Nothing can make a difference now. The bleakness of the remark exceeded its occasion. Poirot heard in it not sorrow for Benedict, but the exhaustion of someone who sees an old barricade collapsing. Mallory folded the codicil. Who knew of this? Only Harwood and Miss Dean, if her word is to be taken, said Richard. Charles spoke sharply. He told me he meant to repair an old injustice. That may be near enough. And you, Mrs. Harwood? Agnes answered, I assumed some absurd bequest was contemplated. Benedict liked gestures. I did not imagine he intended to displace his own blood in favour of a stranger. A stranger, Clara repeated. It was scarcely more than breath. Eleanor laid a hand on her arm. Clara did not look at her, but neither did she move away. His fingers hovered near Julian's frame but did not touch. Instead, he observed the faint square of cleaner marble beneath it, showing that the frame had lately stood a little further left. Mallory followed his glance. What is it? A photograph with nervous habits. The inspector, not being a fanciful man, merely grunted. Miss Bell said from her chair, That frame was never in one place for long, even when Julian lived. Mrs. Harwood was forever setting it straight.
Agnes replied at once. Because it was always being knocked by careless dusting. Ah, said Poirot, and that amuses you?
Sometimes repetition amuses me, madame. He moved away. It was not yet time. Mallory resumed the inquiry. Richard admitted debts with a candour half defiant, half shamed. Charles acknowledged an interview with Benedict concerning Eleanor and money. Dr. Vale disclosed that Benedict had consulted him the previous week not about his health, but about the strain of a domestic disclosure. Miss Bell described the afternoon disturbance in the West Passage. Moxon, recalled and examined, stated that shortly after 8 he had carried Benedict's coffee to the drawing-room and heard his master say to Miss Dean, At 9 then. Everything must be in order by 9. That sounds like the codicil, Mallory said. Or a confrontation, said Poirot. Whose confrontation? The difficulty in this household, Inspector, is that Monsieur Harwood appears to have arranged private judgments for several people at once. A little after 10, when the first violence of formal procedure had softened into that grimmer, slower labour by which houses absorb disaster, Poirot asked if he might see the morning room where Agnes had gone for her smelling salts. Mallory assented. You see, said Agnes, there is nothing remarkable. Poirot looked not at the table first, but at the carpet between table and door. It showed no mark, no mud, no disturbance. Agnes had indeed been there, or might easily have been. And how long did you remain? A minute, as I said. Did you open the library door? No. Did you hear voices? No. Poirot's gaze moved to the mirror over the fireplace. In its glass, the hall could be seen obliquely if the door stood open. He placed himself where Agnes must have stood at the table. One could observe the hall from here, he murmured. She answered too quickly. If one wished to spy. Yes. His tone was absent. If one wished. He turned back. On the escritoire near the window lay a single envelope addressed in Agnes's hand to a charity treasurer in Bath. The flap had not been sealed. Inside there was money, 2 £10 notes. Poirot did not touch it, but its presence impressed him by its studied rightness. Charity prepared in advance, virtue ready for the post. When they returned to the library, the police surgeon had not yet come, and time seemed to have thickened.
Eleanor sat exhausted. Charles stood behind her chair, one hand on its rail. Richard had wandered to the window and was staring into the dark. Clara remained near the desk with an immobility that was becoming more expressive than movement. Only Agnes appeared, at first sight, exactly what she had been at dinner. Yet Poirot, who distrusted exactness maintained too long, saw beneath the surface another fact. Mrs. Harwood was not grieving. She was enduring. That distinction mattered. "Inspector," he said softly, "before the night grows older, I should like permission to examine the west passage and the schoolroom cupboard of which Miss Bell spoke." Mallory looked up from his notes. "At this hour?" "At this hour especially. If someone in this house believes a paper remains unfound, the night may tempt enterprise." "Very well." Richard swung round from the window. "A paper? You mean more letters?" Poirot's eyes rested on him, then on Agnes, then on Clara. "I mean," he said, "that when murder and old correspondence meet under the same roof, there is nearly always one document too many, or one too few." At the mantel, unnoticed by most, the photograph of Julian had tilted again, this time toward the onyx clock with its false time, as though the dead young man leaned to hear what had become of his name. Richard said, "Then for God's sake find it." There was more nakedness in the exclamation than he knew. Poirot, who noticed such lapses, merely bowed and took one of the lamps. Inspector Mallory accompanied him. Charles came too. After a moment Clara followed, then Eleanor. Agnes remained in the library, saying she would not leave Benedict alone. Dr. Vale stayed with her. Miss Bell, from fatigue or wisdom, did not move. The west passage ran long and narrow behind the principal rooms, lined with family engravings whose black frames drank the lamplight. Old houses are instructive after violent events. By day they are made for the living. By night they become conspirators, preserving footsteps, drafts, and obsolete arrangements with a fidelity denied by people. At the far end lay the former schoolroom, little used now except for storage. Moxon fetched the key from the housekeeper's board. When the door was opened, a smell of dust, old pasteboard, and lavender bags came out. "There," said Eleanor softly, pointing to a walnut cupboard built into the wall. Inside were photograph albums, portfolios, and cardboard boxes tied with tape. Poirot did not begin by turning anything over. He observed. One album on the middle shelf had been put back in haste. It stood slightly forward of the others, not by much, but enough to disturb a line of accustomed quiet. The dust at its edge was smudged by a recent finger. "Miss Bell said your guardian asked whether Miss Dean had been here," he said to Eleanor. "Who ordinarily comes?" "No one. Moxon or Mrs. Renshaw for spring cleaning, perhaps." "Then why this album?" He drew it out. The leather was cracked. On the first pages were photographs of the Harwoods in the 90s. Picnics, dogs, drives, men in hard collars looking as if a camera were a moral trial. Then younger faces emerged. Julian as a schoolboy, Julian at Cambridge, Julian in uniform. Eleanor gave a little breath. "How like?" She stopped, embarrassed, but Clara had come nearer and was staring at the page. The likeness was not exact. It was in the eyes, perhaps, and something in the line from nose to mouth. Not enough for certainty. Enough to trouble memory afterward. Poirot turned more pages. Between two black paper leaves there was a torn stub where a photograph had been removed. "Ah," Mallory bent. "Can you tell what was there?" "The corners remain." Poirot measured with his finger and studied the pale rectangle left behind. "A cabinet photograph, frequently handled, removed recently." Charles said, "Family sentiment, or family inconvenience?" Clara's face had altered.
I have seen that missing photograph, she said. Mallory looked up sharply. Where? In Mr. Harwood's library not long ago. He had taken it from somewhere and was comparing it with another image. I was not invited to inquire. What image? Asked Poirot. My own passport photograph. Eleanor turned to her in astonishment. When? 3 days ago. Clara's self-control returned as she spoke, but not entirely. He asked for my papers because he said the solicitor required dates for some pension record. When I entered the library with them, the photograph was on the desk.
He covered it almost at once. Did you glimpse it? Only that it was a young woman, dark-haired, seated with one hand on the back of a chair. Mallory said, Elise Vautrin. Possibly. Poirot turned the page. Behind it, inserted loosely as a marker, lay a narrow slip of paper. It had been torn from a memorandum pad and bore in Benedict Harwood's hand 3 words. Ask Agnes first. Nothing more. Mallory pocketed the slip. What do you make of that? That Monsieur Harwood had discovered something and did not yet know whether to accuse, confirm, or spare. Human beings like to postpone cruelty when they intend it with a clear conscience. They examined the remaining shelves. Nothing obvious appeared. Yet when Poirot closed the album, he did so slowly, weighing in his mind not the missing photograph only, but the fact that Benedict had come here, or sent someone here, on the very day he was killed. On the return through the passage, Richard emerged from the darkness near a side stair, startling Eleanor. Where the devil have you been? Charles demanded. Walking. In the dark? Yes, in the dark. Richard's voice was brittle. One thinks better out of sight of policemen. Poirot said mildly, And what have you thought? Richard gave him a crooked smile. That if my uncle meant to acknowledge Miss Dean, he might have chosen a method less theatrical. Clara flushed. You speak as if I arranged it. No, I speak as if he did. The injustice of it hit more widely than Clara alone. Eleanor said, with more spirit than she had shown yet, Mr. Harwood arranged everybody. That does not make them murderers. Richard looked at her. For a moment some genuine affection, almost brotherly, displaced irritation. No, Nellie. Only unfortunate. Back in the library, the house had settled into that oppressive midnight tidiness which follows police routine. Benedict's body had been removed to the spare room above, the carpet beneath his fall shielded for later examination. The desk remained under watch. Agnes sat very straight in the high-backed chair by the cold hearth, Dr. Vale near her. On the side table a tray with coffee untouched had been placed. She might have been keeping vigil over decorum itself. Mallory told her of the missing photograph and the note. For the first time she seemed genuinely unprepared. A note about me? Ask Agnes first, said the inspector. How like Benedict. He always preferred to interrogate under the guise of consulting. And the missing photograph? She lowered her eyes a moment. There used to be an old likeness of the Belgian girl. My husband wished it kept because he disliked waste. I thought it destroyed years ago. Destroyed by whom? Asked Poirot. I do not know. Would Benedict have destroyed it? No. Benedict destroyed nothing that might later serve as evidence. The answer came so spontaneously that it had the force of truth. Dr. Vale said, Harwood had become obsessed this week. He asked me whether heredity showed itself in expression. I told him medicine was not portraiture. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And did he say why he asked? He mentioned Miss Dean, nothing more. Clara was still by the desk. Then he had guessed before the letter? Yes, said Poirot. That is now certain. Agnes said, If Benedict had guessed, why summon the whole household?
Why not speak privately to the woman and settle matters quietly?
Because, said Charles, he wanted witnesses. No one contradicted him. They all knew, in differing degrees, that Benedict Harwood possessed the fatal vanity of the man who believes truth gains dignity by public announcement. Poirot turned suddenly to Dr. Vale. When you examined the body first, Doctor, did you notice anything in the dead man's hand? Vale frowned. Nothing. The right hand was open, the left beneath him. Any torn paper? Thread? Ash? No. Yet the desk drawer was open, said Poirot almost to himself. He reached for something, or had just put something away. Mallory said, the old letter from Elise could have been what he expected. But it had not yet arrived. The inspector gave a grunt of reluctant agreement. At 1 o'clock, Moxon brought word that the household had been secured and the servants accounted for. No outsider could have entered from the terrace without leaving mud at the French windows. None had. The library door from the hall was the only probable approach. That narrowed the matter uncomfortably upon the house itself. Eleanor, pale with fatigue, leaned against the chair back. Charles urged her to go upstairs, but she refused. I could not sleep, and if I sleep now, I shall wake into it again. There was such simple truth in that even Agnes softened slightly. My dear child, she began. Eleanor turned, and something long suppressed came out of her with surprising directness. Please do not call me child tonight. Everything has changed, and you know it. Agnes stared at her as if struck. Then her face closed. It was a small scene, but Poirot marked it. Emotional truths, when they surface under strain, often illuminate older loyalties. Eleanor had not spoken merely from shock. She had spoken from the first stirring of distrust. He went once more to the mantel. The photograph of Julian stood exact now. Beside it, the little silver frame of Benedict and his wife had acquired in shadow a melancholy softness. Poirot lifted the onyx clock, not the photograph, and set it down again. Its base had left a thin crescent in the dust. Inspector, he said quietly, tomorrow we shall speak with the solicitor, examine the writing materials, and search for the removed photograph. But tonight I think the answer lies still here in the room, among the things too carefully preserved. Agnes's gaze flickered to the mantel and away so quickly that had one blinked it would have been lost. Poirot saw. Inspector Mallory at last insisted that the ladies retire. Agnes objected to leaving the library until the final police formalities were complete. Eleanor objected to leaving Agnes. Clara objected to neither, but clearly intended not to move unless told. In the end, Poirot solved the matter by proposing coffee in the morning room, for those from whom he still required facts. It sounded practical. It was also strategic. He wished to separate fatigue from performance. One by one, said Poirot, and without eloquence. Mademoiselle Dean first. Clara inclined her head. She seemed calmer now, but it was the calm of a person whose life has cracked in some silent place, and who is determined that the sound shall not be heard. You were born in Brussels? So I was told. By Madame Dean? Yes, she was a dressmaker. She died 7 years ago. Did she ever speak of your father? She said only that he had been an English gentleman who did not know of my existence. Agnes shifted ever so slightly. And your mother? She died when I was small. Madame Dean was not related to me, but she had known my mother in some capacity connected with the convent. I understood little. Did you come to England by chance? No, through employment. Clara hesitated. 2 years ago, I answered an advertisement for a companion secretary placed, I think, through a London agency. I was interviewed by Mrs. Harwood first. Richard turned.
My mother interviewed you. Yes, Agnes said coolly. I interviewed all applicants. Benedict could not endure dealing with agencies. Poirot steepled his fingers. And when you saw Mademoiselle, did she remind you of no one? Agnes met the question with admirable steadiness. I thought her self-possessed. That was not what I asked. Her eyes hardened. If you mean Julian, no. People are forever manufacturing likenesses after the fact. Eleanor looked from one woman to the other. But Uncle Benedict thought there was one. That is why he took the photograph. Yes, said Poirot, and perhaps why he asked whether Miss Dean had gone to the schoolroom. Clara frowned.
Why should he think I had? Because he had begun to suspect a truth, and was wondering whether you suspected it also. She drew a slow breath. Then he meant to tell me tonight. Before witnesses, said Charles. Perhaps to protect you, Eleanor said softly. Clara's mouth altered with a faint, almost bitter sadness. Or to enjoy the justice of it. Nobody contradicted her. Poirot turned to Agnes. Madame, when you engaged Miss Dean, did the name Vautrin mean nothing to you? The name Dean was given to me. I do not concern myself with a secretary's baptismal history. Yet Sister Ursula's name you remembered instantly. That was a family wound. Some wounds, said Poirot, are preserved with more care than others. He shifted at once before she could answer. Monsieur Richard, your uncle's note said 9 o'clock. Why? Richard rubbed a hand over his face. Because that was when he liked pronouncements, before bed, so one had the night to digest them. That is a cynical answer. I ask again. Richard stared into his cup. The flippancy fell away. Because I had asked him for money by noon tomorrow. There. Is that plain enough? How much? 5,000. Eleanor exclaimed. Charles swore under his breath. Agnes said, Richard! He gave a laugh of self-disgust. Yes, mother. A vulgar figure. There are more vulgar ones. For what purpose? Asked Poirot. To settle debts. Cards? Partly. He looked suddenly at Charles. And to prevent a certain man from making himself offensive. Who? Richard's jaw set. A fellow named Levitt. He lent money upon the note of my expectations. Your expectations, murmured Poirot, which tonight became less secure. Exactly. If Uncle Benedict had signed that codicil, I should still have had enough to live on, but not enough to reassure jackals. And did he tell you of the codicil? No. He merely said at luncheon that I had mistaken indulgence for right too long. Did you threaten him? Richard lifted his head sharply. No. Then, after a pause, not in words. Agnes closed her eyes briefly. It was not grief. It was weary mortification. The fatigue of a woman long obliged to manage a son's deficits while preserving the tone of a house. Poirot turned next to Charles. And you, monsieur? Your danger was not debt? Charles answered directly. No. Reputation, perhaps. Benedict disapproved of me, and had once paid off a youthful liability on the understanding that I would make something of myself. He had a way of recalling benefactions when it suited him. Tonight I believed he meant either to forbid my engagement to Eleanor or to attach conditions to her settlement. Eleanor flushed. He had already done that without telling me. I found a letter from his solicitor last month saying my marriage portion would be delayed if my husband entered political life or speculative business. Charles laughed without mirth. There, the old man reached from beyond every conversation. Did you quarrel after dinner?
Poirot asked. No. You expected to? Yes. And therefore, if Benedict died before 9, the interview most damaging to you never took place. Convenient. Charles accepted it. Yes. That simple acceptance had weight. Poirot noted it. Dr. Vale, who had thus far been silent, now said, If you mean to examine me also, do it. My motive, if you require one, would have been professional impatience. Benedict took pleasure in treating emotional matters as if they were legal points. Poirot studied him. You were fond of someone in this house. The doctor stiffened. Eleanor looked startled. Charles looked annoyed. Agnes looked, for the first time, faintly interested. Vale said, That is irrelevant. Nothing human is irrelevant. Was it Mademoiselle Vane? Yes. The word came out before prudence. He mastered himself at once. Years ago. It no longer matters. Charles's hand tightened on his chair arm. Eleanor said in dismay, Simon! Vale rose. Please do not make a scene of old feeling. I never troubled Miss Vane. Benedict knew of it and disliked me the more for behaving correctly. Poirot nodded. Thank you. Sit down. For a little while no one spoke. The fire had sunk low. The flowers on the table gave out a heavier scent. Outside the rain had ceased, and the house listened to itself. Then Miss Bell appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, stubborn as age can be when it refuses exclusion. I have remembered something, she said. Agnes frowned. Honoria, you should be in bed. I should have been in bed in 1898 if everybody had got their wishes. She came in and sat down without invitation. This afternoon, when Benedict spoke to me in the West Passage, he had in his hand not only an album, but a little key. I remarked that the schoolroom cupboard had not required a key for years. He said, Not that key, another old refuge. I thought he meant the key to his wit. No, I wonder. Poirot leaned forward.
A little key? Of what shape? Flat-headed. Brass, I think. Quite small. Inspector Mallory, who had come in unnoticed during the last exchange, said, Could it be the one found on the hearthrug? Moxon was summoned. The key, already bagged by the police, was brought. Miss Bell peered at it. Larger than that. This one is for an ordinary drawer. The other was slighter. A hidden drawer, said Richard lightly, then looked ashamed of the lightness. Poirot's eyes moved to the library beyond the hall, to the mantel, to the photographs, to the onyx clock. Perhaps, he said. Agnes said at once, Foxley Court is not a melodrama. There are no secret panels. No panels, perhaps, but old desks, old chimney-pieces, old habits. Poirot rose. Madame, when you sat in the library after we left, did you remain in your chair? The question came so unexpectedly that even Agnes could not mask the instinctive flash in her eyes. Certainly. Without approaching the mantel? I had no reason to approach the mantel. Of course. He passed into the library with Mallory beside him. The room looked altered now that the body had gone. Murder empties a room and leaves behind not absence only, but accusation. Poirot stood before the mantel and regarded the photographs once more. Julian's face, young and honourable, confronted him with that peculiar pathos which belongs to the dead who have never had the chance to grow disappointing. He lifted the smaller silver frame of Benedict and his wife. Nothing. He lifted the onyx clock. Nothing. Then, with a gentleness almost reverent, he took up Julian's frame. Behind it, set into the wood surround where one would not see it unless the frame were removed, was a narrow brass escutcheon no larger than a thumbnail. Mallory exhaled. Well, I'll be. Shh. Poirot's voice was no more than breath. The little aperture was empty, but the dust around it had been freshly disturbed. Mallory bent close, careful not to breathe upon the wood. So there was a hiding place after all. A very modest one, said Poirot. The English are shy even in secrecy. The opening was too small for anything bulky. Poirot passed a finger lightly around its edge. There, caught against the brass, was a filament, no more than a thread, violet in color. Inspector. Mallory squinted. Ribbon. Perhaps from a sleeve, perhaps from a bookmark, perhaps from one of those pious little packets in the morning room. He did not touch it yet. The inspector fetched tweezers from the police case and removed the thread carefully into an envelope. A woman's work, Mallory murmured. Poirot gave the faintest shrug. Colors are not evidence, only invitations. Behind them in the doorway, Agnes said, Have you discovered your melodrama after all? She had entered so quietly that only a person expecting resistance would have done it. Her gaze moved first not to Poirot, not to Mallory, but to the place behind the removed frame. Then she understood that the movement had betrayed her and looked at Poirot with cold anger. You knew of it, he said. I know now. No, madame. You knew before you crossed the threshold. Her composure held, but barely. I know old houses. One expects foolish contrivances. Ah, yes, especially when one has already emptied them. Richard appeared behind her. Mother? Agnes turned on him so sharply that he stopped. Do not stand there gaping. It was the first time her control split into something near violence. The effect on Richard was curious. His face, habitually easy in irresponsibility, hardened into an older expression, one perhaps learned in childhood. I am not gaping, he said. I am wondering what you are afraid of. Poirot intervened before the answer came. Inspector, seal the library for the night after you have photographed this place. But first we ask one question of everybody. Who knew Monsieur Harwood concealed papers behind the frame of his son? No one admitted it. Clara looked merely astonished. Eleanor genuinely so. Charles shook his head. Dr. Vale said he had never gone near the mantel except to warm himself. Miss Bell, when summoned, cackled softly and said that Benedict had always preferred obvious hiding places because he believed other people too stupid to examine the obvious. And Mrs. Harwood? Asked Mallory. Miss Bell's old eyes sharpened. Agnes knew everything Benedict did in that room, if she disapproved enough. Agnes said with dignity, That is a spiteful remark. It may nevertheless be true, said Poirot. The hour was now too late for civility to disguise exhaustion. Eleanor began to tremble from fatigue. Charles insisted on taking her upstairs. This time she submitted, but before leaving she came to Clara. I am sorry, she said simply. For what? For the way truth arrives in this house, always as if it wished to humiliate the person who needs it. Clara's face softened for the first time that night. Thank you. The little exchange pierced Poirot more than louder scenes would have done. In such moments, one measures what innocence remains available to be injured. When Eleanor and Charles had gone, Mallory posted a constable by the library and proposed that the rest should finally attempt some sleep. Richard refused. He prowled from mantel to window and back again until Poirot, watching him, said quietly, Monsieur, when a man walks in straight lines, it often means he fears circles. Richard stopped with a laugh that was almost a groan. Do you want my whole disgrace? Very well. Levitt was not my only reason. Benedict told me last week that he intended to tell the family something about Julian. I thought it concerned my inheritance. Tonight when the letter came, I knew it did.
Did you confront him before dinner? I tried. He said only, at 9. Then he smiled. I hated him for smiling. Hatred is common, murder less so. Richard ran a hand through his hair. You think me capable of stabbing an old man over a codicil? I think you capable of rage. I have not yet decided whether you are capable of silence after rage. Richard seemed about to answer, then looked away. No, he said at last. I am not. Poirot believed him. Near 2 o'clock the house at last began to disband. Agnes retired with Dr. Vale's arm, not because she needed support, but because yielding to it preserved appearance. Clara asked leave to remain a little while in the morning room. Mallory, after brief thought, allowed it if Poirot stayed. Richard went to the billiard room for brandy. Miss Bell had already been marched upstairs by a maid under protest. Thus the morning room became quiet, lamplit, and unexpectedly intimate. Clara sat by the extinguished fire, hands folded, her gaze upon nothing visible. Poirot remained standing until she said, You need not guard me. I do not guard. I accompany. She gave a faint smile at that, and then, because strength had its limits, let her face change. It did not crumple. It became younger.
All my life, she said, I have believed that the blank place in a story may be endured if one is disciplined enough. One says, there was a gentleman, there was sorrow. There is no use in being curious. And then, in one room, before witnesses, one is told that one belongs to a dead man in a photograph, and to a woman who wrote letters no one answered. Poirot sat opposite her. Yes. Did he know? Benedict Harwood, I mean. Did he know long enough to send for me, to watch me, to compare my face with hers? I think he knew enough to enjoy certainty in stages. The bitterness flashed through her. Then I cannot even mourn him properly. No, said Poirot, not properly, only truthfully. She laughed once, very softly. That sounds like mercy, but it is not. Little is. After a pause, she said, There is something else. On Tuesday, Mr. Harwood asked whether I had ever received a medal from a convent. When I said yes, a cheap thing, with St. Cecilia on one side, he looked almost triumphant. I wear it sometimes in my workbox for luck. Madame Dean gave it to me when she died. Have you it now? In my room. Do not move it. Inspector Mallory shall see it in the morning. Do you think it proves anything? Perhaps only that your mother, Elise, wished a child to retain some thread to the place of origin. People do these little things because otherwise life feels too abruptly cut. She studied him. You are kinder than your face suggests, Monsieur Poirot. He smiled. Happily, mademoiselle, many things in this house are not as they first suggest. A step sounded in the hall. Agnes had returned, or rather had never fully gone. She stood in the doorway, her wrapper of dark silk closely drawn, her pale face sharpened by fatigue. I came for my book, she said. On the side table lay one of the devotional booklets tied with violet ribbon. Poirot's eyes rested on it. Then on the envelope in Mallory's hand, containing the violet thread from the hidden aperture. Agnes saw the direction of his glance. Again that minute involuntary tightening passed over her expression. You suspect me because I read pious works? She asked. No, madame. I suspect you because when grief, inheritance, revelation, and old letters are placed before several people, you alone seem consistently anxious about who touches objects. Her reply came after a moment. Order is all that stands between families and barbarism. Sometimes, said Poirot. It is also what stands between truth and exposure. She took up the booklet. As she did, the violet ribbon slipped loose and trailed across her hand.
It was not precisely the same shade as the thread from the hidden compartment, but near enough that the eye remembered the resemblance. Agnes retied it with quick, competent fingers. "You will find," she said, "that those who live by interpreting human weakness often flatter themselves that they can distinguish virtue from self-command." "And can you?"
For the first time, a real expression showed in her face. Not merely control, but contempt mixed with fear.
"I have had more use than you for self-command, Monsieur Poirot."
She went out. Clara whispered, almost to herself,
"Why does she hate me?"
Poirot looked at the closed door.
"Because, perhaps, you have come back from the past in a form she cannot govern."
In the hall, the constable shifted his weight. The house gave a small, settling creak. Through the open door of the library, one could see, upon the mantel under police sealing paper, Julian Harwood's photograph removed from its place, leaving behind a pale, clean rectangle on the dark wood, an absence more eloquent than presence. The absence remained when the night began to pale. It was not dramatic. No one at Foxley Court threw open shutters to exclaim over dawn. The lamps simply lost authority. The black panes of the hall windows thinned to a diluted grey, and all at once the faces of the tired became older. Inspector Mallory, who belonged to that useful English breed capable of functioning on bad tea and a conscience, had the servants assembled in turn below stairs. Poirot attended not because servants necessarily know more, but because they know differently. Mrs. Renshaw, the housekeeper, supplied household routine. Moxon supplied times. A maid named Alice supplied nervous observations delivered with painful honesty. It was Alice who said that at a little after 8, while carrying hot water past the side passage, she had seen Mrs. Harwood standing near the library door, as if listening. "Only I would not say such a thing, sir, unless asked." "You are asked," said Mallory.
The girl twisted her apron. "Then yes, sir. Only when she saw me, she went at once into the morning room."
Agnes, confronted, said with chilling calm that she had paused because she thought she heard Benedict call. Alice, intimidated, instantly looked as though she wished herself unborn. Yet Poirot had what he needed, not proof, but a contour. Moxon added another trifle. At dinner, Agnes had inquired with unusual particularity whether the last post had come from the station and whether any express messenger had been delayed by the flooded lane.
"Did that surprise you?"
asked Poirot.
"A little, sir. Mrs. Harwood does not generally concern herself with post-bag details."
"Did Mr. Harwood?"
"The master had asked twice since luncheon whether anything had arrived from abroad."
"From Brussels, specifically?"
"Yes, sir."
This was important. Benedict had expected the letter. Agnes had known he expected something from Brussels. Fear, then, had time to ripen before the bell rang. When Clara's little St. Cecilia medal was brought down from her room, it proved plain enough. Brass, worn at the edges, with a convent stamp on the reverse, and the initials E.V. scratched almost invisibly near the clasp. Mallory took possession of it. Clara watched without protest.
"It is absurd," she said quietly. "All my life this object meant merely that someone once held me and did not wholly abandon me. Now it becomes evidence."
"Everything becomes evidence after a murder," said Poirot. "Even grief." Mallory asked whether he had seen or searched the library during the night after being dismissed.
"No."
"Did you know of the recess behind the photograph?"
"No."
He glanced at Poirot. "Though I remember now that when I was a boy, my uncle once caught me dusting there and told me never to meddle with a dead man's place. I thought he meant sentiment."
"A dead man's place," said Poirot.
"Julian's photograph. He was always the saint of the house. My uncle never got over him. My mother never forgave him." Agnes,
seated by the breakfast room window under the watch of a constable and the eye of her own fatigue, said crisply, "What nonsense!" Richard turned to her with a strange composure. "Is it? You disliked Uncle Benedict for mourning Julian the wrong way. He made sorrow theatrical. You made it moral. The result was the same. We all had to live beside it." The silence after that was very still. Poirot saw in Agnes's face for an instant the true injury. It was not accusation that wounded her. It was disrespect. He carried that observation with him when, a little later, he asked to inspect her writing table. Mallory obtained permission with official blandness. Agnes submitted because refusal would have been louder than consent. The morning room in daylight looked smaller and less persuasive. The charity envelope still lay where Poirot had first seen it, now sealed and addressed. The devotional booklets remained upon the side table, tied with violet ribbon. A small basket held note cards, sealing wax, and correspondence tabs. Everything was exact. Too exact, perhaps. An orderly person tidies from habit. A frightened person tidies for concealment. Poirot lifted nothing at first. He looked. One booklet had been retied more tightly than the others. The loose ribbon end showed a frayed place where a thread might have pulled free.
Mallory saw him notice it. "You think she used it at the recess?" "I think only that when a ribbon frays and a thread appears elsewhere, coincidence requests examination." Within the writing basket lay a small ivory paper knife. Not the murder weapon. That remained in police custody. But Poirot took interest in the object because its presence showed Agnes's taste for neat openings, neat separations, neat little interventions. Beside it stood a bottle of violet ink. Benedict, Clara had already said, used black. "Madame writes letters of comfort," said Poirot. Agnes from the doorway replied, "And you read morality from stationery?" "Sometimes from the choice of colour." She did not answer. The solicitor, Mr. Penfold, arrived shortly after 11, puffing with shock and importance. He confirmed that Benedict had instructed him 2 days earlier to prepare a codicil, provisionally recognizing Clara Dean if documentary proof of her parentage came from Brussels. More interestingly, he stated that Benedict had also asked whether a prior interference with correspondence, if proved, could amount to actionable fraud after many years. "Did he name the person?" asked Mallory. "He did not, but he referred to a woman who confounded moral judgment with the right to dispose of other lives. Those were the exact words." Agnes rose with a rustle of silk. "Really, Inspector, must every unpleasant phrase spoken by the dead be arranged to point at me?" Poirot said softly, "If the shoe pinches, madame, it is not always because another has selected the size." Penfold, alarmed, coughed and produced one more item. Benedict had posted no letters that afternoon, though he had written at least one. He said he preferred to deliver the point orally after all. "Then what became of the note card found in the hall?" Poirot mused. No one knew. It remained another of those small, separate pebbles that later form a causeway. At luncheon, which no one called luncheon, though food was set down and neglected, the first genuine false certainty of the case took shape. Mallory received a telephone message. Levitt, Richard's moneylender, had come forward under pressure. He reported that Richard Harwood had sent word the previous evening that, if the old man did not come round by night, there would be hell to pay. Richard swore violently. "That meant money, not murder." "It sounds ugly enough," said Mallory. "It was ugly enough. I wrote it in disgust after my uncle kept me waiting all afternoon." Agnes closed her eyes. "You see what you have done." "My dear mother, I have done many things. I have not stabbed Benedict." The inspector's look hardened. For an hour, suspicion bent strongly toward Richard. His debt, his expectation, his message, his temper, all made a persuasive pattern. Charles, to Poirot's annoyance, seemed half persuaded himself. Eleanor, however, was not. She found Poirot by the terrace doors while the others were occupied with statements.
"If Richard had done it," she said, "he would already have confessed part of it by accident. He cannot keep guilt inside. He leaks."
Poirot smiled faintly.
"It is true. He is weak, vain, selfish, and incapable of sustained concealment. One sees every feeling he has if one waits 5 minutes. You have known him long, all my life, and Aunt Agnes all my life too." She stopped. "Yes?"
Eleanor's gaze shifted to the lawn where the wet grass shone under a thin, unwilling sun.
"Aunt Agnes never leaks. That is what frightens me."
There it was, the emotional truth of the section, and more than emotional. Poirot laid it carefully beside the other pieces. By mid-afternoon, he asked Mallory to have the mantel photographs examined for prints and the writing materials compared. He knew such evidence might be spoiled by household handling. Nevertheless, modern police pieties must be satisfied. Yet his real interest had turned elsewhere, to the arrangement of movement, knowledge, and fear. In Benedict's desk drawer, among tied packets, they found a memorandum from Brussels dated 3 weeks earlier. It acknowledged an earlier inquiry and said only, "The matter of Mademoiselle Claire Dean can be clarified if old assurances no longer govern your household." The phrase struck Poirot at once.
"Old assurances,"
he repeated. Mallory said,
"Promises, or threats, or bargains."
Agnes, hearing from across the room, said sharply,
"Continental women are melodramatic in expression."
Poirot turned.
"And English women, madame?" "English women," she said, "endure until they act."
For 1 second, something burned through her composure so nakedly that even Mallory saw it. Anger, yes, but beneath anger, terror of exposure. Not for gain alone, but for identity. Then it was gone. The photographs were replaced upon the mantel after examination, except Julian's, which Poirot himself set down a little to the left of its former place. No one remarked it but Agnes. Her eyes went to it at once, involuntarily measuring the wrongness. She moved half a step as though to correct it, and stopped when she found Poirot watching. He bowed slightly. She folded her hands instead. And that refusal to touch the frame told Poirot more than an incautious word might have done. The afternoon stretched under interrogation, weather, and fatigue, until every person at Foxley Court seemed reduced to some more essential outline of character. Richard grew sullen, then reckless, then repentant by turns. Charles became quieter the more suspicion brushed him, as if principle in him tightened under pressure rather than unraveled. Clara moved through the formalities with an obedience that had almost dignity enough to resemble pride. Agnes remained exact. Exactness, Poirot reflected, is a virtue only until it begins to exclude the accidental. Life always includes the accidental. Only the person who edits too hard becomes suspicious. He asked for Dr. Vale in the little conservatory that opened from the morning room, more for privacy than beauty, for the flowers there had long ago ceased to believe in themselves. Water ticked in a stone basin. Outside, gardeners and police constables, equally out of place, avoided one another among the wet paths. "You withheld something yesterday," said Poirot. Vale looked tired enough to tell the truth. "Probably several things. One in particular. When you first knelt by Benedict Harwood, what did Mrs. Harwood say to you?" The doctor's face changed. "Why that?" "Because, mon ami, you are loyal, and loyal people do not lie gracefully when silence would serve."
Vale made a movement of impatience. She said, before I had properly examined him, "It was quick then." I assumed she meant to spare him suffering. Did she touch him? No. Then how did she know it had been one blow? The doctor stared. Anyone could see the knife. Could they?
In the confusion, with everyone crowding the doorway, with the body partly turned. Perhaps. Perhaps not. I ask only that you consider whether she spoke as one inferring or as one already knowing. Vale's mouth tightened. You press too far. No. I press where the cloth gives. The doctor turned away to the grey glass. If you are right, then she used me. I will not easily believe that. Because you admired her strength? He gave Poirot a quick look. Yes. There, another human fact. We admire in others the very discipline we fear lacking in ourselves. When Poirot returned to the library, Mallory had received preliminary word on the photograph frames. Clear prints were hopeless, unsurprisingly. Too many hands, too much household polishing. But the backing of Julian's frame showed signs of recent removal from the wall, and one corner of the cardboard insert had caught a trace of violet ink. From the morning room basket, perhaps, said Mallory. Or from a letter handled there, said Poirot. He asked for the note card found beneath the express tray. Compared with Benedict's hand, it was unquestionably genuine. On its blank reverse, under a bleak light, appeared the dent of a phrase written on the sheet above it and torn away. Poirot, using a pencil softly over paper laid atop it, brought out the impression enough to read, "Come before they join us." Only that. Ah, said Poirot. To whom? Asked Mallory. Precisely. The card had not been for a servant at all. Benedict had written or begun to write a private summons, likely for the evening, then not sent it, or sent another version. If so, someone had been asked to come before dinner or before coffee. Someone who preferred not to acknowledge it now. He showed the impression to the household one by one. Charles denied receiving any such note. Richard swore he had not. Clara looked startled and said no. Eleanor shook her head. Agnes, after the smallest delay, said, Benedict often scribbled imperatives to people and forgot them. Did he scribble one to you? Asked Poirot. No. Did he speak to you before dinner? Of course. We dined together. Alone? For 10 minutes, yes. Eleanor was dressing late. The others had not come down. This had not been stated before. What did you discuss? He was irritable. He said he intended to put a stop to certain hypocrisies. And you? I told him he enjoyed producing them. For the first time, Poirot almost smiled. That, at least, sounded like truth. Yet as Mallory continued, another piece emerged from Moxon. At 6:30, just before dressing, Benedict had asked whether Mrs. Harwood was in her room, and when told yes, had sent up not a verbal message, but one of his own visiting cards. Moxon had delivered it. Agnes had not mentioned receiving such a card. Mallory turned to her at once. Did you receive it? She hesitated, and in Agnes Harwood, hesitation was as loud as panic. Yes. What did it say? Only that Benedict wished to speak to me before dinner. Where is the card? I destroyed it. Why? Because it was trivial. Poirot's eyes rested on her face. So trivial that when we found another card hidden beneath the tray, you did not mention the first. Agnes answered with iron precision. I do not inventory scraps of pasteboard under strain. Richard laughed harshly. No, you inventory everything else. The remark would once have silenced him. Now it struck home. Agnes turned toward him with something like hatred. Not maternal woundedness, not anxiety.
hatred born of a son who ceases to support the role his mother assigned him. Poirot asked for the interview before dinner. Agnes resisted, then yielded in outline. Benedict had confronted her with the Brussels inquiry. He had accused her of meddling years ago between Julian and a woman named Elise. Agnes admitted only that she had warned the girl off. Benedict, she said, had become morbidly romantic about the matter and had spoken wildly of restitution. Did he mention Miss Dean? Yes. And what did you say? That if he chose to elevate a paid employee upon sentimental grounds, he would humiliate us all. Humiliate? Repeated Poirot. Surely you understand English family life, Monsieur Poirot. There are decencies. Ah, yes, said Poirot. The decencies which often survive truth by many years. Clara, who had listened without movement, said then with astonishing quiet, You mean that my existence is indecent? Agnes met her eyes. I mean that some stories do not improve by exhumation. No, said Clara, only by silence. For the right people. Eleanor, standing near the window, shut her eyes. The cruelty of the exchange had stripped away the last conventional deference between them all. Foxley Court no longer contained a family under strain. It contained separate moral positions forced into the open. Toward evening, as a watery light failed again, Poirot requested that the mantel arrangement be left precisely as it stood. Mallory agreed. Yet when Poirot returned from speaking briefly with Penfold in the hall, he found Julian's frame once again minutely altered, nudged square with the shelf edge. No one admitted touching it. But Eleanor, who had been watching from the doorway, said quietly, Aunt Agnes cannot bear a crooked line. She used to stop me in lessons and make me erase whole pages if my margin wandered. Agnes answered without turning, Good habits are not crimes. No, said Poirot, but some crimes lean upon good habits for disguise. The phrase upset Richard more than Agnes. He crossed abruptly to the drinks tray and poured brandy with shaking hands. Why not say it plainly? You think my mother did it because she dislikes disarrangement? Not because she dislikes it, because she worships control. Agnes rose. Her poise was intact, yet beneath it something had begun to crack audibly to those with ears for such things. If you have an accusation, make it. I will not sit here while every domestic preference is turned into symbolism. Poirot bowed. Not yet, madame. There remains one question, and it is the most important. When Benedict Harwood learned that Clara Dean was Julian's daughter, what did that destroy in you? No answer came. Only that deadly stillness which is itself a kind of speech. From the hall door, Miss Bell, who had appeared without notice as usual, said in her dry voice, It destroyed the version of the past she had been living on. Agnes rounded on her. You know nothing. The old lady looked back steadily. On the contrary, I know just enough to be sorry. Poirot took that sentence into himself and held it there. Sorry. Not outraged, not triumphant. Sorry. It suggested an older pity, perhaps an older knowledge. He turned to her. Then you will dine with us tonight in the drawing-room, Mademoiselle Belle. All of you will. Afterward, if you please, we shall assemble in the library. Mallory glanced at him. He understood. The staircase had begun to build itself. The staircase had begun to build itself, and with that strange inner economy which belongs to great houses in catastrophe, dinner was nevertheless announced. No one thought of refusing. People will sit down before silver and linen when they cannot endure open waiting. Ceremony becomes a temporary shelter from meaning. So they went, pale and disciplined, into the dining room where Benedict Harwood had presided 1,000 times, and where his empty chair now possessed a terrible authority. Very little was eaten. Knives and forks made restrained, alien sounds. Richard drank too much wine and then forced himself into sobriety. Charles scarcely touched his plate. Eleanor, white but composed, performed each small action as if politeness toward the servants had become the last defense of civilization. Clara sat opposite Agnes. Neither looked at the other. Poirot noticed that when the decanter passed, Agnes aligned it exactly with the silver stand before releasing it. Habit, yes.
But habit, intensified by strain, becomes revelation. After the meal, he asked Miss Bell if she would take a turn in the little conservatory. She agreed at once, as though she had long expected the summons. The old lady lowered herself onto the cane chair with a sigh not altogether of age.
"Well," she said, "you have reached the part where memory becomes indecently useful."
Poirot sat opposite.
"You said you were sorry." "Yes." "For whom?" "For nearly all of them, even Agnes, though she would dislike being petted. Especially Agnes, perhaps, if she has at last done what I have feared she might someday do." "You feared it?"
Miss Bell folded and unfolded the fringe of her shawl.
"Not murder in particular, some irreparable act of will. Agnes was never affectionate, but she believed absolutely in right order as she defined it, and once such women persuade themselves that disorder is sin, they permit themselves terrible corrections."
Poirot waited.
"In 1901, she said, "Julian Harwood was in love with a young Belgian governess whom Mrs. Matthew Harwood had engaged for a cousin's children. Agnes detested the connection. She thought foreigners lax, artists vulgar, and poor women dangerous. Elise Vautrin came once to Foxley in distress while Julian was away. I met her in the hall. Agnes took her into the morning room. I heard raised voices. Elise left weeping. Afterward, Agnes burned one letter in that grate and wrote another in violet ink."
Poirot's eyes sharpened.
"You are certain?" "Certain of the burning, less certain of the contents. But that same week Julian received a note. I saw only the hand was Agnes's, after which he rode to Havisham and returned looking as if some inner bone had broken. He never spoke Elise's name again."
"Did you tell Benedict?"
"I hinted. He called me fanciful. Men of his sort accept evidence only when it flatters their timing."
"Yet lately?"
"Lately, Benedict asked whether Agnes had once used violet ink. I told him yes."
He looked almost happy. The word in relation to Benedict had its own accusation. "Last night," Poirot said, "did you see anything when the cry came?" Miss Bell stared through the glass where her own faint reflection wavered among geraniums.
"I was the slowest to move. As I entered the hall, before the others crowded the library, I saw Agnes at the mantel inside the room, not long, just the touch of a second. Her hand went to Julian's frame. Then she stepped back as if she had only lost balance. I told myself I must be mistaken. One always tells oneself that first."
Poirot inclined his head. It was enough. He went directly to Inspector Mallory. The inspector listened without interruption and then said, "We search her room now." Agnes received the proposal standing in the doorway of her chamber, fully dressed, as though she had rejected the possibility of private collapse.
"On what grounds?"
"On grounds that a man is dead and evidence missing," said Mallory. She did not step aside at once. Then, with an almost imperceptible lift of the chin, she moved. The room was as orderly as everything Agnes touched. Garments brushed, books squared, the silver-backed brushes aligned. Order can be innocent. Here it looked defensive. The first drawers yielded nothing but linen. The writing case produced old charitable lists, unanswered invitations, devotional verses copied in violet ink. The dressing table held no secrets. Poirot's eye went instead to the work-basket on a low stand near the bed.
Not because women conceal crimes in feminine objects more often than men, but because Agnes had been too clever not to place incriminating things where male attention grows embarrassed. Inside were threads, darning wool, ribbons, buttons, a little mother-of-pearl thimble. Beneath them lay a narrow brass key on a length of violet ribbon. Mallory took it up. No one spoke. Poirot said softly, "The key of the recess behind Julian's photograph, I think." Agnes's face remained almost expressionless, but the expressionlessness had become effortful. "Many old keys exist in old houses." "Indeed, we shall test it." Also in the basket, between patterns for mending cuffs, was a folded paper packet. When opened, it yielded the missing cabinet photograph from the album. A young woman seated with one hand upon the back of a chair, dark hair dressed simply, grave eyes lifted with an appeal half brave, half wounded. Clara Dean, looking over Mallory's shoulder, made a small sound as if the photograph had struck her physically. "My mother," she whispered. Behind the photograph lay a memorandum in Benedict's hand. "Agnes, you denied memory. Brussels has given it back to me. Tonight, before witnesses if need be, you will tell the truth of Elise Vautrin, of the letter you suppressed, and of the child whose life you put aside for the sake of your precious order. If you refuse, I shall proceed without you."
B.H. Richards sat down on the edge of the bed as though his legs had ceased to belong to him.
"Mother,"
Agnes said, very distinctly,
"he was a cruel man." The sentence was not denial. Mallory looked up at Poirot. "We have enough to arrest." "Not yet," said Poirot. The inspector frowned. "What more do you want?" "The whole truth. Not because the law requires poetry, but because justice without understanding is only procedure." Agnes laughed then, once, and the sound transformed her more than any tears might have done. It was not mad, it was exhausted and bitterly lucid. "You always admired that in him," she said to Poirot. "The elegant completeness, the arranging." "No," said Poirot, "I merely prefer not to accuse at the wrong rung of the staircase." He asked that everyone go to the library. The room had been restored as much as it could be restored. The body was gone, the stain upon the carpet covered, the desk papers neatly set aside under Mallory's supervision. Yet no restoration can return innocence to a place once used for murder. The air itself seems to remember interruption. One by one they came in, Eleanor and Charles together, Clara alone, Dr. Vale grave and inward, Richard with a face from which all careless youth had been stripped, Miss Bell upright as reproof, Agnes last, carrying herself with the formal composure of a woman entering church for a service she disapproves of, but intends to endure better than anyone else. Poirot had replaced Julian's photograph on the mantel, but not quite square. Agnes saw that immediately, her eyes fixed on it for a fraction too long. Then Poirot took his place by the hearth. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, "we are at the final stage. This house has offered us money, scandal, old love, humiliation, inheritance, wounded vanity. All these are useful. None is yet the heart. Let us see if we cannot arrive there by steps." He laid the brass key, the violet ribbon, Elise Vautrin's photograph, Benedict's memorandum, and the old convent letter in a line upon the desk. No one moved. Outside, the evening closed against the windows. Inside, at last, the truth had gathered enough shape to enter the room. "We begin," said Poirot, "not with the murder, but with a habit." He looked toward the mantel where Julian Harwood's photograph stood, once more and deliberately a little awry. "In this room the small disorder has repeated itself all through our inquiry. The frame becomes crooked. Someone notices. Someone wishes it right. That might seem nothing, but in a house such as this, where the life has been governed for years by rules of appearance, a small recurring wrongness is like a crack in porcelain. It draws the eye because it announces that control has failed somewhere. Agnes said with weary scorn, "You are making poetry of dusting." "No, madame. I am making psychology of correction." Poirot folded his hands. "You could not endure the frame crooked because behind that frame lay the little recess where Benedict Harwood had hidden the papers that threatened you. Each time it shifted, danger looked at you." Richard made an involuntary sound. Clara did not move. "That is the first step," said Poirot. "The second. Benedict knew the truth before the express letter arrived. The letter from Sister Ursula did not create the crisis. It completed it. We know this because Benedict had already made inquiry, prepared a codicil, compared Miss Dean's face with the photograph of her mother, and written to his solicitor regarding old interference with correspondence. Therefore, the murderer did not kill in sudden panic at the contents of an unopened envelope. The murderer killed because the truth was already at the door." He let the words settle. "Third, who had that truth to fear most deeply? Mr. Richard Harwood feared money. Mr. Fenwick feared humiliation and perhaps a financial trap. Dr. Vale feared emotional discomfort. Miss Dean, if innocent, had reason to wait for revelation, not to prevent it. But Mrs. Agnes Harwood feared something far more fundamental: the collapse of an identity sustained for 25 years. Agnes laughed softly. "Grand language." "Exact language," said Poirot. "You had lived as the guardian of standards, the woman who kept the house, the family, the memory of the dead son, all in correct relation. Yet long ago you had done a thing which, if exposed, would reveal not moral guardianship, but moral usurpation. You placed yourself between Julian Harwood and Elise Vautrin. You intercepted Elise's letter. You wrote another in violet ink. You burned evidence. You told yourself it was for decency. In reality, it was because you would not permit disorder, meaning any life not arranged by you, to enter the family." Miss Bell bowed her head. Richard stared at his mother as if seeing the architecture of childhood all at once. Agnes said, "I sent away an adventuress." Clara spoke then, and her voice was steadier than anyone's. "You sent away my mother." Agnes turned to her. "I sent away a woman who would have ruined Julian. By loving him, by trapping him, by pregnancy, by foreign melodrama, by need." There it was at last. Not composure, but the old contempt from which the whole crime had sprung. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Merci, you saved me time." He continued, "The fourth step. Benedict confronted you. He sent you a card before dinner. Come before they join us. Moxon delivered it. You admitted receiving it only when pressed. In that interview, Benedict showed you at least part of what Brussels had taught him. He intended restitution. He intended also that you should confess before witnesses if necessary. His memorandum proves it." Agnes's hands tightened together. "You left that interview not merely angry, but in a condition more dangerous than anger. You were cornered by history. At dinner you asked about the foreign post and the express messenger because you knew the final documents might arrive at any moment. When Benedict left the drawing room after coffee, he went to the library to fetch the red file and prepare himself to speak at 9 o'clock. To Richard perhaps, to Miss Dean, to all of you. Then you made your movement." Poirot turned to the company, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "Mrs. Harwood said she went for smelling salts. She did go to the morning room, but not at once. The maid Alice saw her listening at the library door. Miss Dean heard a step moving toward the library. Mrs. Harwood wished to know whether Benedict was alone, whether the letter had come, whether there was still time. There was. Agnes's mouth opened, closed. She had not yet lost control, but it was no longer effortless. "You entered the library," Poirot said. "Perhaps you begged him first to spare the family. Perhaps you accused him of public cruelty. That part hardly matters. He refused. He may even have pointed to the hidden recess, or to the photograph, or to the file, as proof that he would not retreat. You saw the paper knife upon the desk. One thrust, quick, exact.
You were right about one thing when you asked Dr. Vale whether it had been quick." Vale flinched. Poirot went on. "You had not time then to search at leisure. The front bell rang. The express messenger arrived. You left Benedict on the floor and returned toward the drawing room. Then came Mademoiselle Vane's cry, the rush, the confusion. In that first confusion you delayed a second in the library doorway and touched Julian's frame. Miss Bell saw you. Why? Because you feared the recess was visible. Later, when circumstances allowed and everyone's attention moved elsewhere, you removed the contents using the little brass key you had kept for years on the violet ribbon in your work basket. Mallory stepped forward and laid the key upon the desk with a click. The violet thread in the recess, the frayed ribbon, the key in your basket, the photograph of Elise hidden among your mending, Benedict's memorandum hidden with it. Together they are not coincidence, madame. They are a chain. Richard said hoarsely, "Mother, why keep the photograph?" For the first time Agnes answered not Poirot but her son. "Because your uncle had no right to make a relic of my humiliation." Poirot seized it gently. "Ah, now we come to the heart." He stepped closer to the fireless grate. "You did not kill only for money. Money was secondary. Yes, Miss Dean's recognition would reduce Richard's portion. Yes, you would lose influence. But what drove the knife was older and deeper. To Benedict, exposing the past was justice. To you, it was annihilation. He would have forced you to admit, before the household and before the daughter of the woman you despised, that for 25 years the tragedy of Julian Harwood had rested not upon female treachery, not upon foreign weakness, not upon fate, but upon your intervention. You had judged another life unfit and disposed of it. You had made an orphan in the name of order." Agnes rose. She did not collapse. Christie's world does not require theatrics from the guilty. Truth itself is theatre enough. She stood very upright, one hand on the chair back, and for a moment it seemed she might still outlast the room by force of will alone. "You speak as though I had been given easy choices," she said. "You know nothing of what it is to hold a house together when men indulge themselves and women are left to deal with consequence. Matthew died. Julian would have disgraced us all. Benedict admired passion in others because he never had to clear away after it. I did what had to be done." Clara's face went white, but she did not speak. Poirot said very softly, "And when the child existed?" Agnes's composure wavered. "The child was provided for." "By convent charity and a dressmaker's pity." "It was sufficient." "Was it?" Her voice sharpened. Better that than to drag a bastard into Foxley Court and call it sentiment. Better that than Julian bound to a woman who knew how to weep at doors. Better that than Benedict with his grand amends, his staged righteousness, his desire to exhibit me as if I were the culprit in his private assize. The last word escaped before she could contain it. Culprit. Not wronged, not misunderstood. Culprit. She heard herself say it. So did they all. Eleanor covered her mouth.
Richard stared at his mother in a stunned, almost childlike misery. Dr. Vale closed his eyes. Charles looked away, as decent men do when another person's self-deception tears open in public. Poirot said, "Yes, he would have exhibited you. That was Benedict's defect. He loved justice with an audience. That his vanity does not acquit your crime." Agnes turned suddenly to Clara. Whatever mask remained fell then. "Do you think he wanted you? He wanted absolution. He wanted to place you in this house, establish you, and enjoy his own magnanimity. Men always prefer restitution when it flatters them." Clara answered after a moment, and her voice was full of a sorrow far older than yesterday. "Perhaps, but at least he had begun to see me." The sentence destroyed Agnes more completely than accusation. One saw why at once. For a quarter of a century she had lived by the conviction that what she erased ceased to matter. Here stood the living contradiction. Her shoulders bent, not much, but enough. "I only wanted," she said, and the words seemed dragged from some place unused to honesty. "I only wanted things not to become common." Poirot regarded her with grave pity. "That is the tragedy, madame. You called life common when it would not obey your arrangement." Mallory stepped forward. "Mrs. Harwood, I must ask you to come with me." Agnes did not protest. She seemed suddenly old, not by years but by the draining away of purpose. Yet before the inspector touched her arm, she looked once more at Julian's photograph on the mantel. "It was always crooked," she said in a dull voice. "He would slam the library door when he was young. The frame never sat straight after." Poirot answered, "No, madame.
It was the past that never sat straight after." That, perhaps, was the true end of her resistance. She lowered her head. As Mallory led her out, Richard made as if to follow, then stopped. He put a hand over his eyes and remained where he was. Dr. Vale turned away to the window. Miss Bell, very upright, said nothing at all. Clara remained by the desk. Her gaze had gone to the old letter from Elise Vautrin, lying beside the recovered photograph. She touched neither. "What happens now?" Eleanor whispered. Poirot looked at her, then at Clara, then at the place on the mantel where the frame had been moved and moved back, and never once sat without significance. "Now," he said, "the living must decide whether truth is to become another weapon, or the beginning of mercy." Charles drew nearer to Eleanor. Richard lowered his hand and looked not at Poirot, but at Clara. "I am ashamed," he said. The plainness of it gave the words value. "Not only of last night, of many things." Clara answered, "So am I, though not perhaps of the same." A faint, sad smile touched Miss Bell's mouth. "That is a promising distinction." Poirot took up Julian's photograph at last and set it square upon the mantel. Then he placed beside it the photograph of Elise, not hidden, not dramatized, merely there. "The dead," he said, "are often kinder when allowed to stand together." Poirot glanced once around the room, the desk, the recovered papers, the exhausted young faces, the old woman by the door, the moral wreckage left by one act of proud correction repeated over years, and his own face assumed that composed sadness which was perhaps his truest expression. "One may preserve order in a room," he said. "One must be very careful not to murder the truth for the sake of it." The end.